Number 13. Kendra Gill. A young pageant queen from the beautiful state of Utah traded her crown in for criminal charges back in 2013 after her poor judgment landed her in deep trouble with the law. In what they later described as a simple, harmless prank, 18-year-old Kendra McKenzie Gill and 3 others allegedly threw homemade bombs at their friends' houses and driveways during a nighttime joyride. While responding to reports from several concerned residents about the sounds of explosions, police discovered the leftover remnants of bottle bombs made from tinfoil, toilet cleaner, and water bottles. Luckily, nobody was injured, and the teens claimed that they didn't actually mean to hurt anyone. But still, law enforcement took the situation seriously and charged each suspect with multiple felony counts of possession of an explosive device. After her arrest, Gill gave up her Miss Riverton title and a $2,000 scholarship that she was given with it. But the loss of her crown was nothing compared to the 15 years in prison she could have faced if convicted on all of her charges. All 4 defendants took a gracious plea deal and admitted to a misdemeanor charge of attempted possession of a chemical device. As part of the chosen agreement, the judge agreed to wipe the charge off their records if they each completed 200 hours of community service and paid a measly $500 fine. Some community members thought it was ridiculous that the teens were initially charged with full-on felonies. Prosecutor Blake Nakamura argued that the charges were appropriate, considering the potential for the bombs to cause serious injury, and that the state could have laid even harsher charges on the defendants if they'd wanted to, including an enhancement for gang activity. Gill admitted that the prank was a massive, stupid mistake, and that she and her friends didn't think about what they were doing or the consequences until after they got in trouble. Luckily, the outcome gave them a chance to consider it a hard lesson learned and avoid a permanent criminal record. You know what they say, kids will be kids even when they're committing felonies. Number 12. Tipsy teacher taunts police. While responding to a car accident inside a parking garage located in College Station, Texas one night back in 2022, police officers calmly pulled a kindergarten teacher named Allison aside and asked her for her side of the story. She admitted that she'd accidentally rear-ended another vehicle with her car, claiming that the other party had slammed on their brakes suddenly. She also immediately admitted that she had had 2 shots of alcohol and a beer. Allison repeatedly said that she was fixing her hair when the crash took place and that she was sweaty and uncomfortable because the air conditioning in her car was not working at the time. She also made sure to point out that she didn't want to get too drunk because she had to go into work the next morning. When the cop asked her to rate her level of intoxication on a scale from 1 to 10, she placed it at a solid 5. He then asked the woman if she thought she was okay to continue driving, and she said that she thought she would be fine. The tipsy teacher agreed to undergo a series of field sobriety tests, and she actually thought she did pretty well on them, but the officer completely disagreed. He told Allison that he didn't think she was in any condition to drive, so she asked if she could have a friend come and pick her up. It hadn't yet sunk in that she was getting arrested on suspicion of driving while intoxicated until the officer ordered her to put her hands behind her back. After learning that Allison's car was going to get towed, the young woman's boyfriend grew upset with the police and asked why he couldn't just take it home. The officer mentioned that it probably wasn't safe to drive because of the damages from the accident and said that he would arrest the boyfriend if he tried to drive it onto the road. Allison wasn't happy about getting placed under arrest, but she made light of the situation while waiting in handcuffs to be picked up and taken to jail for booking. She even posed for a photo for her social media, and when she called her boss to let them know she might not be coming into work the next morning, she jokingly asked if they would put her mugshot on a t-shirt. While Allison and her friends definitely weren't the most disrespectful group the cops had ever dealt with, they also weren't exactly the most pleasant or polite people they'd met. While standing just a few feet from the arresting officer, Allison's boyfriend told her that she should have refused to take the field sobriety test. But she couldn't undo what was already done, so she continued to cooperate as she was placed inside of a police car and taken to the county jail. Number 11. Isaac Grimes. After struggling to make friends or form relationships in high school, a lonely teenager from Colorado Springs named Isaac Grimes was beyond thrilled to be taken under the wing of an upperclassman named Simon Sue. The two met in 1999 and soon started bonding over their shared love of chess and video games. And when Sue invited Isaac to join his Operations and Reconnaissance Agents Club, or OARA for short, the impressionable sophomore jumped at the chance to get closer to Sue. Isaac saw joining the OARA as a chance to connect with more young men like him and make some desperately needed friends. For the first time in his life, he actually felt like he'd found a band of brothers with shared interests who looked out for one another in times of need. The teenager's parents had mixed feelings about Isaac's quickly developing friendship with Simon Sue. They were glad that their son was finally making friends, but they suspected that Sue might have had ulterior motives and was manipulating their impressionable son. At first, the OARA seemed like a self-improvement group for respectable and like-minded young boys who shared similar values and interests. They were against using drugs and alcohol, and they had a zero-tolerance policy toward racism of any kind. But over time, the club took on paramilitary overtones and became more extremist in its beliefs. Sue allegedly told Isaac at one point that the OARA had ties to the government of Guyana, where his family was from, so the group started training with guns and weapons. There was also a military-like structure, with members having ranks like Lieutenant Major and Lieutenant Colonel. Isaac later went on to claim that Sue made him watch videos of horrifically graphic killings, and that on one occasion he was forced to eat and drink until he puked. He would also accuse Sue of forcing him to carry out burglaries and other crimes. Most people would walk away from abusive friendships like this, but the OARA was the only social life Isaac knew, and he didn't want to go back to being lonely. He was also brainwashed into believing that the club was training him to defend Guyanese forces in an upcoming military coup. At some point, Sue allegedly started threatening to kill Isaac and his family if he didn't do what he was told. Believing that the OARA was a massive global organization with powerful connections, Isaac was afraid to go against his leader's orders. During a 2009 interview with ABC, he said that he eventually grew so scared that Simon was watching his every move that he was afraid to even turn the lights on while using the bathroom in his own house. In reality, the OARA was not big or powerful at all. And Simon wasn't the untouchable high-ranking vigilante he depicted himself as. If everything Isaac claimed was true, then the group was definitely dangerous. Based on the young man's allegations, the OARA could be described as a cult that targeted lost boys who were so desperate to belong that they were willing to sacrifice anything, including their ability to think for themselves. On New Year's Eve in 2000, Isaac went to the house of his friend Tony Dutcher. After eating some dinner and playing a game of Scrabble, he approached Tony from behind in their outdoor fort and fatally slashed the boy's throat. Tony's grandparents were used to the boys being outside for multiple hours at a time, so they didn't wonder where Tony was, even after Isaac came back inside the house. He was still there at 4 o'clock in the morning when another friend, John Matheny, drove over to the property and came inside the home. When Tony's grandparents woke up to the commotion, Matheny shot them both dead on the spot. During police questioning, Isaac claimed that Sue ordered him to kill Tony as a way to prove his loyalty to the OARA while he was on so-called probation. Although Sue didn't directly help with the murder, he was held equally accountable for ordering the hit. He denied being a cult leader, and instead of talking up the OARA, he downplayed the group as a simple, harmless boys' club. To avoid a possible life sentence, Sue pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder. He was given a 53-year prison sentence, while John Matheny was sentenced to 66 years for the same charge. Isaac Grimes pleaded guilty to murder and is currently serving a 60-year sentence. In hindsight, he realized how naive he was to believe that a fellow high schooler was running a powerful international paramilitary group. He also realized that he could and should have reached out to an adult for help, escaping the cult environment. But he can't undo what's been done, and at almost 40 years old, he has spent well over half his life behind bars. According to records, Grimes will become eligible for parole in 2026, but could remain locked up until as late as 2056. Number 10. Social media feud leads to gang shooting. After a social media feud between rival gang members spiraled drastically out of control, a young man from Brownsburg, Indiana named Freddie Hegwood was mercilessly shot to death in December 2020. Hegwood was minding his own business, sitting in a car, when someone pulled up in another vehicle right next to him and fired multiple shots at the young boy. The teenager died from his injuries, and another person in his car narrowly avoided the gunfire. At least one of the bullets hit a nearby home, but thankfully no one was hurt inside. By the time police officers arrived at the scene, the perpetrators had already fled. But investigators didn't have to look very hard to figure out what led up to the shooting. They quickly found out that Hegwood had been caught up in an ongoing dispute on social media with a few different people, and that the parties had exchanged vicious insults and threats in the days before the young man's death. Police identified the suspects as Tyrionte Jackson, Kamarian Moody, Jeremy Perez, and Antonio Lane. 3 of the men fled the state to California and were captured about 7 months after the murder took place. It was unclear who actually fired the fatal shots, but prosecutors held all 4 suspects equally accountable for the crime by charging them all with murder, attempted murder, and criminal recklessness. Moody, Lane, and Jackson were found guilty and were handed prison sentences ranging from 95 to 140 years, which means that they'll most likely spend the rest of their lives behind bars, all thanks to a social media spat. These 3 defendants have since appealed their sentences, while Perez was acquitted of all charges. Number 9. Rose May and Tristan Kindle. It's common for young couples to romanticize the idea of running away from the law together, but these modern-day Bonnie and Clyde fantasies don't seem so appealing once a pair of fleeing criminals are sitting alone in a jail cell. This was the case for Rose May and Tristan Kindle, who were reported missing in northern Ohio by worried family members in 2015. According to Wyandotte Sheriff Michael Hetzel, the couple had left the state in a stolen pickup truck after stealing some ammunition from a Walmart. The teens allegedly drove to Pennsylvania, stealing 1 or 2 more cars along the way, while hiding out in the wilderness to avoid law enforcement. A few days into the search for the runaway pair, police in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, responded to a call about an armed robbery taking place at a convenience store. When an officer tried to pull May and Kindle out of a stolen car, they quickly drove away, dragging the cop for a short distance before he finally fell to the ground. Thankfully, his injuries were non-life-threatening and he recovered. Dozens of emergency responders and volunteers then joined in on the search effort, which continued into West Virginia. The suspects were finally placed under arrest in the town of Elizabeth after leading police on a 12-mile chase in a stolen pickup truck. After crashing the car, the couple tried to flee on foot, but they had second thoughts about continuing after they jumped into the Ohio River and realized that they probably wouldn't be able to make it across. May and Kindle were then transported back to Ohio, where they were charged with multiple crimes and booked into custody while awaiting their next court date. Number 8. Kevin Watkins. After coming back home from school one day and getting frustrated with his family's slow Wi-Fi connection in February 2018, a teenager from Georgia named Kevin Watkins changed the network's password so that his Xbox would be the only device running on the connection. But that simply wasn't going to fly with the rest of the family. Kevin's mom tried taking the Xbox from the boy's bedroom, and it somehow led to a confrontation between the young boy and his 19-year-old sister, Alexis. Court testimony later revealed that Kevin put Alexis in a chokehold and refused to let her go, even as his brother helplessly tried getting him to release his tight grip on Alexis's neck. More than 10 minutes passed by before police got to the scene and pulled the teen off his sister. Alexis was killed by her injuries, and authorities eventually charged Kevin with murder. During his bench trial, which left his fate up to a judge instead of a jury, Kevin's lawyer argued for a lesser conviction of voluntary manslaughter. The judge found Kevin guilty of murder and sentenced him to serve life in prison. When the newly convicted killer was given a chance to speak up in court, he was sobbing so hard that the only words anyone could actually understand were, "I'm sorry," but it was too late to take back what he'd done. Number 7. McKenzie Shilla. In July 2022, 2 young lives were needlessly lost and another was forever ruined when an Ohio teenager named McKenzie Shilla crashed her car into a building at nearly 100 miles per hour. McKenzie's boyfriend, 20-year-old Dominic Russo, and a friend, 19-year-old Davion Flanagan, were killed at the scene. When police got there, McKenzie was passed out with her foot still pressing on the gas pedal. She underwent multiple surgeries, but survived her many injuries. The car was almost completely crushed from the sheer impact of hitting the brick wall. Horrifying footage from just a few moments before the wreck showed the car barreling along a residential street at an alarming speed. After concluding that the crash wasn't a simple accident, authorities decided to charge McKenzie with 2 counts of murder. Prosecutors accused her of deliberately crashing the car because she and Dominic were having relationship issues. Black box data from the vehicle indicated that she had the pedal pressed fully down to the floor and made no attempts to ease up on the gas or brake whatsoever. McKenzie denied killing either victim on purpose and maintained her story that the wreck was unintentional. During McKenzie's bench trial, which left a verdict up to the judge, not a jury, her aunt testified that the teen and her boyfriend did not have a rocky relationship. But the court heard several audio recordings of McKenzie threatening Dominic with physical harm, suggesting that the couple had more problems than people were aware of. In an attempt to reduce McKenzie's culpability, her mother argued that the young woman suffers from a condition that makes her prone to passing out, and that this could have been the cause of the crash. McKenzie's defense attorneys argued that there was no way of knowing exactly what went down in the car, and that Dominic may have been trying to grab the wheel from his girlfriend's hands. The judge disagreed with the out-of-pocket claim, instead describing McKenzie as literal hell on wheels, who carried out her deadly mission with precision. She was eventually found guilty of 2 counts of murder and received a life sentence with a minimum of 15 years. Number 6. Teen stomped at Target. In a brutal act of violence captured on camera, a helpless teenager from Redlands, California was cornered and assaulted by 4 grown men at a Target during the summer of 2023. Video footage of the incident showed the attackers surrounding the victim and taking multiple swings as disturbed witnesses gathered around. In a desperate bid to defend himself, the victim tried taking a punch at the men, but he was hopelessly outnumbered and was quickly tackled down to the floor. The attackers then proceeded to kick and stomp on the victim's head, while terrified bystanders called 911. At some point during the clip, the victim could be heard desperately begging the men to stop attacking. Police reported to the scene not long after and immediately launched an investigation, but the victim was unwilling to give them a statement. So far, no charges have been filed in the case because of this, and the cause of the brawl remains unclear. This was the second incident of its kind to happen in the same shopping plaza within a month-long period. In general, violence inside retail stores is steadily on the rise, with the Target chain being especially hard hit by this problem. The spike comes during an increase in shoplifting among Target stores, which experienced a massive 120% surge in the first 5 months of 2023 alone. Number 5. Kayla Henriquez. 22-year-old Kamisha Richards and 18-year-old Kayla Henriquez were neighbors who grew up together in Brooklyn's Cypress Heights neighborhood. They grew to be close friends over the years, but their bond was finally broken one day in 2011 when Kamisha lent Kayla $20 to buy some supplies for her baby and suspected her of using it for things she didn't actually need. The upset gal pal instantly demanded her money back, and the young women fought for the next 3 days as they went tit for tat on social media, airing out their dirty laundry for all their friends and family to see. At one point, Kamisha got so angry that she decided to go over to Kayla's apartment, take her baby's milk out of the refrigerator, pour some of it out, and say that it amounted to half of what she was owed in money. The disagreement only got worse from there, as the feuding BFFs took things into a nearby bedroom. Just moments later, Kamisha came stumbling out of the room with a single stab wound to her heart. She was quickly rushed to the hospital, where she passed away from her injuries, despite emergency responders and doctors' best efforts to save her life. During police questioning, Kayla said that Kamisha had come at her with a pair of scissors, so she ran to grab a kitchen knife and stabbed her former friend to defend herself. Kayla seemed strangely calm at the start of the interview, as if she didn't understand the seriousness of what had really just happened. Meanwhile, Kamisha's loved ones struggled to come to terms with the realization that the victim had lost her life during a dumb, petty dispute over a measly $20. Prosecutors charged Kayla with her friend's murder, which would have come with a sentence of 25 years to life if convicted. Instead of risking an actual trial, Kayla pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to just 15 years in prison. She'll become eligible for parole next year in 2024. Number 4. Megan Joyce Emirowicz. It's common for teenagers to act on their decisions without fully thinking them through first, and in some very sad cases, this impulsiveness can have devastating, long-lasting consequences. A 19-year-old woman from Michigan named Megan Joyce Emirowicz learned this lesson the hard way back in October 2021, when she became explosively upset at her father and reacted with deadly violence. According to reports, 64-year-old Conrad Emirowicz had a pretty bad drinking problem. It was normal for him to be drunk at home, but authorities believe he got extremely intoxicated on the day in question, and that Megan had finally reached her breaking point when he was too drunk to drive her to an appointment she'd made at a hair salon. Fed up with her dad's behavior, the teen threw multiple objects at Conrad, including a loaf of bread, and doused him with a deadly mix of lye powder and water while he peacefully napped on the sofa. She then left him there for a few hours as he lay unconscious with severe chemical burns covering his head, torso, and extremities. Conrad was then taken to the emergency room later that day after being discovered by one of Megan's friends, and remained hospitalized in the intensive care unit for months as he tried to recover. He was eventually released for in-home hospice care and died just 3 days later. Authorities charged Megan with felony unlawful possession or use of harmful devices causing death and misdemeanor domestic violence. She was held in custody until her case finally went to trial, and she faced a possible life sentence if convicted. A jury found her guilty on both counts, so she was sentenced to serve 1 year in prison with credit for the more than 500 days she had already served in county lockup. This meant that she walked free and was able to carry on with her life despite being the one responsible for her dad's fatal injuries. In a statement, Megan said that she wasn't the monster the prosecutors tried to depict her as, and that her father was her hero and closest friend. Number 3. Disastrous teens disrespect stranger's home. A Glendale, Arizona resident was just about to move into his recently purchased home in 2023 when a neighbor suddenly called him and told him that there was a huge party taking place inside the residence. The owner rushed over and was shocked to find hundreds of strangers smoking, drinking, and engaging in other forms of party antics. Trashed with broken glass, garbage, beer bottles, and footprints all over the walls, the home had incurred at least $2,000 worth of damages. The horrified homeowner later informed police officers that he lived alone with his dog and that nobody else would have had a key to the house. Responding officers removed the partygoers from the property, and the owner immediately scheduled a professional cleaning appointment for the next morning. But when he got to the property bright and early a day later, he was shocked to find several people sleeping in his bed and all over his house. Police once again had to come to the scene, where they surrounded the house with plans to arrest everyone still inside. They could see several people trying to peek through both the first and second story window blinds as they prepared to make their move, and 2 of the partygoers were caught trying to sneak out of a window and onto the roof. 7 people were arrested that day, and 4 suspects were hit with multiple charges, including criminal trespassing and criminal damage to the property. At a time that was supposed to be exciting for this new homeowner, he was instead left feeling completely unsafe and worried that he would be targeted again in future break-ins. The incident also made several neighbors uneasy, especially since there were a few vacant homes in the neighborhood at the time, and they feared the troublesome teens might target those houses next. To prevent history from repeating itself, the homeowner equipped his new house with security cameras and started a dialogue with other community members about ways to make sure the neighborhood stayed safe at night. Number 2. Nadia, Schwartz, and Justin Hooker. In March 2020, the body of a young man was discovered along the Conestoga River in Murray County, Georgia. Police were unable to find a wallet, cell phone, or other identifying items near the corpse. The man had been shot 3 times in the head and 1 time in the chest. Authorities later identified the John Doe as 27-year-old Kenny Bunn after getting a missing persons report from his grandmother. Bunn left his home to walk to a nearby store the day before and never returned. That same night, Bunn's ex-girlfriend, 20-year-old Nadia Schwartz, showed up at his grandmother's house looking for him. Surveillance footage that was captured later on that evening showed Schwartz and Bunn crossing paths and talking to each other at a gas station. Bunn then got into his ex's car and they drove off somewhere. This was the last known time he was seen alive. Kenny's mother later told the Oxygen series Killer Couples that her son met Nadia Schwartz online a few years before his death in 2019. The couple had broken up 3 or 4 months before Kenny was killed, but he still had strong feelings for Nadia, so the two remained in contact. He hoped that they would eventually get back together, but within a month or two of the breakup, Nadia started dating 20-year-old Justin Hooker. It wasn't long before the pair moved in together. When confronted about the gas station security footage after Kenny's murder, Nadia told investigators that she agreed to give her ex a ride to someone's house nearby, but she got angry when she learned that Kenny was going there to buy some marijuana. She claimed that she kicked him out of the car along the road and never saw him again. Justin Hooker told detectives that he was at a relative's house the night of Kenny's murder. Law enforcement were still suspicious of the pair, but they lacked enough evidence to make any arrests until a jailhouse informant revealed through their lawyer that they recently sold Hooker a gun. After hearing about Kenny's death, the informant was worried the gun might have been used to commit the crime. During a phone call with the inmate, Hooker allegedly confessed to using the weapon to kill Kenny and admitted that Nadia was with him as he did it. After taking a closer look at Hooker's alibi, detectives determined that he was lying to police about where he was on the night of the murder. Additional investigation revealed a long-standing feud between the victim and the suspects, stemming from allegations that Kenny abused Nadia while they were in a relationship. Nadia claimed that Kenny started threatening to kill her not long after they first got together. On the night of the murder, she and Justin planned to confront Kenny with their accusations. According to Nadia's version of events, Kenny tried to grab and strangle her at the scene, giving Hooker no choice but to shoot the man in her defense. But the evidence didn't quite fit with the story. Police observed a lack of injuries, suggesting that Nadia hadn't been strangled or violently attacked. Prosecutors argued that Nadia manipulated Justin into killing Kenny by making him think they wouldn't have a good relationship unless Kenny was completely out of the picture. In reality, there was no valid reason for going to such extreme lengths. With a growing stack of evidence against them, Justin Hooker and Nadia Schwartz both decided to plead guilty to murder. They were each sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years. Number 1. Ryan Furlow. A high schooler from Howard County, Maryland, named Benjamin Vasiliev, had no idea he was walking into a trap when he decided to take up an invitation from Ryan Furlow to play video games and watch a movie one night in early 2023. While on a computer in Furlow's basement later that evening, Vasiliev drank a sip of Coca-Cola and had a violent seizure. The soda had been spiked with cyanide, and Furlow had slipped the deadly poison into his buddy's drink while he wasn't looking. Vasiliev passed away from the poisoning 5 days later, and investigators were quick to suspect Furlow. He soon confessed to the murder during questioning and claimed that he was motivated to commit the crime because Vasiliev wasn't putting the same amount of effort into their friendship as he was. Furlow was especially offended since Vasiliev often failed to give him Christmas and birthday gifts, and on one of the few instances when he remembered, he gave his friend a cookbook that Furlow saw on his bookshelf at home. The disgruntled teen was also offended by the fact that Vasiliev didn't even bother to wrap the second-hand gift. In a normal situation, a friend who doesn't feel that their gestures are being matched will simply scale back on their own efforts to make things fair, or they might try to talk to the friend in an attempt to work out any misunderstandings. But as Furlow silently boiled over with anger for months, he eventually decided that the only viable solution to the problem was to kill Vasiliev. He was quickly charged with first-degree murder. In a chilling confession tape that was played during his trial, Furlow said that he tried really hard to forgive Vasiliev, but that his anger ate at him and eventually became impossible to move past. He fully admitted that he felt a strong desire to hurt and take Vasiliev's life. Prosecutors claimed that Furlow was lying about being angry over things like birthday gifts and being taken taken seriously enough by Vasilyev. Instead, the state argued that Furlow had actually fallen in love with Vasilyev's girlfriend and killed his friend out of sheer jealousy. Furlow's defense attorneys focused their argument mainly on their client's ailing mental health and asked the jury to find him guilty of a lesser charge of second-degree murder or manslaughter. The teen's mother blamed her son's crime on adverse effects from the antidepressants he was taking. Jurors were unconvinced that Furlow deserved even the slightest bit of leniency, and they found him guilty of first-degree murder after deliberating for a little less than 3 hours. He was sentenced to life in prison with the chance of parole. As of 2023, he is still behind bars. Number 8. Roxana Sakori. Lauren and Jeff Sakori thought they were giving their 3 adopted children from Poland a better life by bringing them to the United States and raising them in Wayne County, Michigan. They went out of their way to ensure that the kids had a safe and stable upbringing so that they wouldn't worry about the painful realities they'd faced in Poland. But one of the kids, Roxana, struggled with painful memories and other trauma. And like most teens, she didn't open up to her parents about her inner feelings. Instead, she turned to the internet, where she met an older man named Michael Rivera in 2014. There are different versions of what happened next, depending on who you ask. Rivera was facing legal trouble due to the age gap between him and Roxana. Some people believe he manipulated his younger girlfriend into hatching a plot to murder her family so they couldn't cooperate with the case against him. Others think that the couple worked together to plan a massacre of Roxana's family and that they were both equally responsible in the scheme. Shortly after 2 a.m. one October morning, Roxana cut her brother's throat. He survived, and the plot to kill the entire household was thwarted when another family member saw what was happening, screamed, and woke everyone up. Roxana Sakori and Michael Rivera were charged in connection with the crime, including the parts of the sinister plot that they failed to carry out. Prosecutors made it clear that they planned to hold Roxana accountable to the fullest extent of the law, despite her parents' plea for leniency and mental health treatment as an alternative to prison. As far as the state was concerned, Roxana was capable of making her own decisions and deserved to be treated accordingly under the law. The Sakorskis blamed the bulk of the murderous plan on Rivera, believing that he'd influenced their daughter to agree to something she would have never otherwise even thought about doing. A lot of people agreed with them, while many others sided with the prosecution's heavy-handed approach. The one thing that most people agreed on was the fact that Rivera deserved to spend the rest of his life behind bars, and they got their wish in 2015. A jury convicted him on 4 counts of conspiracy to commit murder and 1 count each of assault with the intent to murder, using a computer to commit a crime, and assault with a dangerous weapon. Roxana begrudgingly took a plea deal and admitted to 1 count of assault with intent to murder in exchange for having the other 6 counts against her dropped, and as a result, she was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison, far shorter than the life sentence she could have faced if she'd been found guilty on all counts. During her sentencing hearing, Roxana stared at the floor as her lawyer spoke to the judge. When it was her turn to talk, she offered a tearful apology to her family. After struggling to get the words out between sobs, she broke down completely. She later withdrew her guilty plea and tried to get a new trial, but ultimately dropped the appeal. And since then, no changes have been made to her conviction or sentence. Do you think it would be fair to extend leniency toward Roxana due to her mental health struggles and young age, or does she deserve to be held accountable as an able-minded adult who is fully aware of the wrongness of their depraved actions? Let us know in the comments below. Number 7. Sha Del Jackson. A 21-year-old University of Wisconsin student named Nathan Potter was walking to his Milwaukee apartment early one morning in 2009 when a young man approached and tried to rob him. Potter had no money, so the thief shot him out of anger, and unfortunately, he died from his injuries. Witnesses implicated 2 men in the crime, along with another shooting that happened later that day. 19-year-old Derek J. Thomas and 18-year-old Sha Del Jackson. Apparently, Thomas acted as a lookout while Jackson pulled the trigger. Jackson was still at large when police caught up with Thomas. During questioning, he claimed that Jackson had contacted him before the shooting, saying he wanted to commit a robbery because he needed money and had a gun. After shooting Potter and leaving him to die on the sidewalk, the suspects fled to Thomas's home nearby and played video games. Thomas admitted that he and Jackson targeted Potter at random while casing a nearby tavern. The two parties didn't know each other, which means that Potter was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. In early 2010, Derek Thomas pleaded guilty to felony murder. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, followed by 8 years of supervised release. A jury then convicted Sha Del Jackson of participating in Potter's murder, and as a consequence, he was sentenced to life in prison. He also received a 5-year sentence for the second shooting, which left a man injured. During Jackson's sentencing hearing, his attorney urged the judge to consider his young age and his lack of impulse control. The judge was unswayed, though, and when she announced that Jackson would spend the rest of his life behind bars, the young offender erupted into a tirade. He shouted obscenities at the judge while courtroom deputies struggled to subdue him. While being led out of the courtroom, he smirked at the victim's loved ones and mouthed a nasty word. In the meantime, his supporters taunted Potter's family, and deputies ended up having to pepper spray Jackson to get him under control. Number 6. Nicholas Lindsay. Nicholas Lindsay acquired a serious criminal record at a young age when he was arrested for grand theft in St. Petersburg, Florida in 2010. In February 2011, he fatally shot a police officer during a late-night encounter near Tropicana Field. The incident happened after a resident called 911 and reported seeing a suspicious man in his backyard. Suspecting the man was a burglar, the caller described seeing the suspect standing outside with a brick in his hand before jumping a fence. Officer David Crawford was the first to respond to the call. A second officer then arrived to find him lying on the ground near his patrol vehicle with multiple gunshot wounds. According to reports, Crawford had been shot while reaching for a notepad. Acting on a tip, law enforcement raided Lindsay's home and arrested him the following day. At his mother's urging, he told the truth during questioning and was arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder. Lindsay's mother, Deneen Sweat, later told local station WFTS that she urged her son to man up and tell what happened. Lindsay's parents were in the interview room with him when he confessed, revealing that he'd thrown the murder weapon in a creek afterward. Much debate followed over whether Lindsay should be tried as an adult, given the nature of the crime. Mayor Bill Foster, who once praised the teen as a troubled youth with the potential to turn his life around, now wanted to see him held accountable the same way anyone over the age of 18 would be. Under Florida's Law Enforcement Protection Act, that meant he'd be looking at an automatic life sentence if convicted. Lindsay was indicted on a first-degree murder charge in early 2011, and he finally went on trial about a year later. His lawyer portrayed him as a scared adolescent and argued that a manslaughter conviction was more appropriate. Prosecutors were quick to point out that all 5 of the shots that were fired struck Crawford, indicating that the shooting was deliberate and therefore qualified as a murder. After being convicted of the murder charge and sentenced to life without parole, Lindsay appealed. It was denied, though, and in 2017, his attorneys asked the court to reduce Lindsay's term to 40 years based on new sentencing guidelines for young people. However, the judge once again upheld the life sentence and said that the court would revisit the possibility of reducing it after he serves 25 years. In footage from the court hearing, Lindsay didn't appear to be paying much attention to the proceeding. And when the judge announced that the life sentence would continue, he could be seen grinning, almost as if he wasn't taking the situation seriously. Number 5. Ethan Orton. 5 months before he turned 18, Ethan Orton's mother told him in an email that he had to move out of their Cedar Rapids, Iowa home by his birthday. More specifically, the message stated that once Ethan was a legal adult, his parents were cutting him out of their lives completely. The following day, on October 14, 2021, police responded to reports of a suspicious person at the residence, and officers arrived to find Ethan sitting outside covered in blood. He quickly confessed to killing his parents, 41-year-old Misty Scott Slade and 42-year-old Casey Arthur Orton, who were found dead inside the house. Both victims had been attacked in their sleep and stabbed repeatedly with a Bowie knife. And after noticing that his mother had survived the initial attack, Ethan finished her off with an axe. When questioned about his motive, he told police that he committed the murders out of a desire to take charge of his life. He later told a psychologist that the email he'd received from his mother pushed him over the edge. Ethan claimed that both his parents had emotionally abused him all of his life and that he'd reached his breaking point. During his trial, a forensic expert testified that Ethan was further agitated because his father had originally taken his side, only to change his mind and side with Ethan's mother. In early 2023, Ethan pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. But under Iowa case law, it would have been unconstitutional to sentence him to life without parole. Judge Ian Thornhill was unmoved by the defense's claims of abuse and a difficult childhood, though, and he felt it was appropriate to issue the harshest sentence possible. During Ethan's sentencing hearing, Thornhill commented on how there's a difference between a teenager disliking their parents' way of running things and being an actual abuse victim. The judge further remarked on the clearly deliberate nature of the killings, including Ethan's decision to follow through with murdering his mother after he realized that she was still breathing. Thornhill imposed 2 concurrent life sentences with the eligibility of parole after 50 years. This means that the earliest Ethan could see freedom again is at the age of 67. It's also very possible that he won't be released, depending on how the parole board feels when the time comes. When he was given an opportunity to speak, Ethan made some remorseful but somewhat puzzling remarks. He thanked his grandmother and sister for forgiving him and noted that they supposedly had proof of the terrible things he accused his parents of putting him through. The teen killer also said the experience made him learn better, whatever that means, and he said that in hindsight, he thinks his parents could have been rehabilitated. He wished he could take back his decision to murder them, but that he'd come to terms with what happened and the fact that it can't be undone. Number 4. Damon Kemp. During the early morning hours of December 7, 2018, police in Daytona Beach, Florida received a call about a break-in at a local apartment complex. Responding officers came face-to-face with a 19-year-old university student from Florida named Damon Kemp, who was accused of trying to force his way into an apartment at gunpoint. Luckily, though, the resident managed to push him out and lock the door. When police arrived, Kemp allegedly walked toward an officer, ignoring the cop's orders to stop. Responding officers noticed that the young man was soaked and he was rambling nonsensically. And at one point, Kemp shouted, "I killed Ace," which was the nickname of his friend, Trey Ingram. Inside an apartment, police found the bullet-riddled bodies of Ingram and Jordan Payton, who were also both 19 years old, and as a result, Kemp was charged with their murders. Prosecutors accused the young man of shooting the victims in the back with a .40 caliber Glock handgun as they desperately tried to run from him. He then washed the blood off himself and disposed of the murder weapon in a nearby pond. Kemp's lawyer argued that the prosecution failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that his client was the killer, and that just because Kemp's handprint was on the gun didn't mean he murdered anyone. And in the event the jurors believed Kemp was the shooter, his attorney claimed that there was enough evidence to conclude that he was legally insane when he committed the crime. There was certainly no doubt that Kemp acted strange in the days leading up to the murder. According to his roommate, he believed that the radio was listening to him and made nonsensical comments, including a remark about National Soil Day. The roommate also claimed that Kemp had put him in a chokehold twice while he was driving. Kemp's strange behavior in court also made it clear that he was mentally unstable. On at least one occasion, he was wheeled into the courtroom in restraints while throwing extremely loud screaming tantrums. And during a bond hearing early on in his case, he repeatedly yelled what sounded like the word God. Then he suddenly went silent and stared blankly toward the front of the room before leaning forward in his wheelchair with a seemingly diabolical look on his face. But being mentally ill didn't mean that Kemp was unaware of the difference between right or wrong. According to prosecutors who failed to provide a motive for the double homicide, the evidence was compelling enough on its own. Not to mention, out of the vast array of strange emotions Kemp displayed in court, remorse didn't seem to be one of them. So, he was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Under Florida law, Kemp faces up to life in prison, yet there was no news of any strange outbursts during his trial or when his conviction was announced. Perhaps he's come to terms with his fate, although if he has anything to say, he'll most likely get the chance when he's officially sentenced. The definition of insanity is much different from a legal perspective than it is from a clinical standpoint, and it's extremely difficult for murder defendants to obtain an insanity ruling in the United States. Consequently, a lot of profoundly mentally ill defendants end up in the prison system, where access to mental health care is minimal at best. Number 3. Willard Miller and Jeremy Goodale. It's normal for high school students to get upset with their teachers from time to time, especially when they think they deserve a better grade on an assignment. But a young man from Fairfield, Iowa named Willard Miller took his anger to a whole new level in November 2021 after learning that he was failing Spanish. Outraged by the poor mark, Miller followed his teacher, 66-year-old Nohema Graber, to a park that she frequently visited, and he was accompanied by a classmate named Jeremy Goodale. The young man grabbed Graber and dragged her into a nearby wooded area where they beat her to death with a baseball bat. Then they hid the victim's body beneath a tarp and stole her van. Grader's remains were found after her family reported her missing the following day. Classmates were quick to point investigators in the direction of Miller and Goodale, and of course the teens were quick to point the finger at one another as the primary actor in the gruesome crime. Miller initially denied hitting Graber at all with the bat, while Goodale accused his friend of being the mastermind of the disturbing plot. Prosecutors, on the other hand, claimed that both suspects participated in the fatal beating and that they planned the crime up to 2 weeks in advance. Graber's family was left broken by her death, which occurred just days before her 67th birthday. Her husband died from cancer days before Miller's sentencing hearing, and Graber's family believes that the heartbreak and stress over the murder is what caused his health to spiral. Instead of moving forward with plans to testify against one another, both young men ultimately decided to take a plea deal in order to avoid a trial. In the end, they each admitted to 1 count of first-degree murder. Miller was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 35 years, while Goodale faces a life sentence with a minimum of 25 years. During his sentencing hearing, Miller apologized to Graber's family. He admitted that he knew what he planned to do was wrong and that he followed through with it anyway. As the gravity of his actions and the reality of his future behind bars sank in, he grew slightly tearful but remained mostly unemotional. The judge was unmoved by Miller's words, so while handing down the sentence, he described the teen as sinister, evil, and brutal. He acknowledged that Miller's young mind wasn't fully developed when the crime occurred, but saw it as no excuse for doing something that was off the charts in terms of the cruelty and violence involved. Miller appealed his sentence shortly after the hearing, and Goodale is scheduled to be sentenced in August 2023. Number 2. Dante Wright. A family's worst nightmare came true on October 4, 2016, when 18-year-old Jordan Klee was found dead from a single gunshot wound in the yard of his Ann Arbor, Michigan home. He'd been killed in a botched robbery attempt by 3 teenagers. 17-year-old Dante Wright was accused of pulling the trigger. His co-conspirators Delreno Gracie and Jamarius Ellison were also charged in connection with the case. By the time Wright's trial rolled around, Gracie and Ellison had already taken plea deals. During pre-trial hearing, he unexpectedly confessed to robbing and killing Klee, hoping to also hop on the plea bargain bandwagon. Prosecutors were on board with the idea, which came with a 25 to 52-year sentence. But the judge almost revoked the deal when Wright grinned during the victim impact statements that Klee's loved ones read in court. As they mustered the strength to face Wright and poured their hearts out, he made a mockery of their pain and suffering. The judge was infuriated by the display and threatened to take the plea agreement off the table and take the case to trial. He then left the decision up to Klee's family, who decided that they wanted to move forward with the plea deal so that they could continue healing from the senseless tragedy. For their own mental and emotional well-being, They forgave Wright despite his despicable behavior. Wright's attorney apologized to the court on his client's behalf, claiming that the young man smiles when he gets nervous. His mother, Antoinette Carter, told MLive.com that she believed her son smiled due to mental health problems. She said that he dealt with everything in life by smiling, but even if that was true, it's understandable that people were bothered by what they saw. At his sentencing hearing, Wright said that he loved his family and that he'd see them soon. He could have personally apologized for the smiling incident, but he chose not to. And while Wright may not languish behind bars until his dying days, he might as well get comfortable because he's going to be in prison until 2042 at the very earliest, while his maximum release date is in 2078. He'll be somewhere between 43 and 70 years old when he sees freedom again. Number 1. Payton Gendron. On May 14, 2022, a 19-year-old white supremacist named Payton Gendron drove 200 miles from his home in Conklin, New York, to the city of Buffalo. Armed with an AR-15-style rifle and with a GoPro camera rolling, he walked toward the entrance of a top supermarket in a predominantly African-American neighborhood and opened fire on innocent people who were just going about their day. The carnage began in the parking lot and continued as the deranged mass murderer walked through the store. 10 people were killed and 3 others were injured by the gunshots, leaving Western New Yorkers devastated, terrified, and infuriated by the unprovoked violence. Responding officers convinced Gendron to drop his gun and surrender, but it would later be revealed that he planned to continue killing people if he managed to escape from the first crime scene. He'd planned the massacre months in advance, and while the signs were easy to notice in hindsight, his concerning behavior was overlooked in the years leading up to the shooting, and any opportunities to intervene were missed. Gendron made no efforts to hide his motive for the mass killing. In fact, he droned on about his reasons in a disturbing 180-page manifesto that he released shortly before he committed the horrific act. Further investigation revealed that he spent a vast majority of his time on the internet connecting with people who shared similar hateful beliefs. Both state and federal authorities charged Gendron with dozens of crimes. Then, 5 months after the shooting, he pleaded guilty to 15 state-level charges, including 10 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder motivated by hate, and domestic terrorism motivated by hate. As a result, he received 10 consecutive life sentences in state prison. Gendron listened quietly and looked down at the floor for much of his sentencing hearing, appearing emotionless at some moments and shamefully aware of his unforgivable behavior during others. And while there's no doubt that he's a cold-blooded, heartless killer, even he couldn't hold back tears during some of the most heart-wrenching moments of the victim impact statements. When it was his turn to speak, he apologized to his victims and renounced his extremist beliefs. And while the emotion appeared genuine on some level, many people understandably find it hard to believe that someone who could commit such an unspeakable act of violence in the first place could ever come to truly regret it. More than once throughout the hearing, family members of Gendron's victims struggled to hold back their anger. They should have never had to face the reality of having their loved ones cruelly ripped from them at the hands of a complete stranger who hated his victims for no reason other than the color of their skin. Gendron's federal case is ongoing. He faces 26 hate crime charges and additional gun-related counts, and he could face the death penalty if convicted. But he's definitely going to remain locked up until his dying day, and will thankfully never get to enjoy even a single moment of freedom again.